Now you see on Infominds, a lot of our content is New York based. We love New York, so it's only fitting that we partner up with a New York based brand. Don't hide the plug. Now they got some fire fitted hats, hoodies, t-shirts, and I'm feeling the old New York design with the bridge logo. They got the clout joints, the dad hats, and you can also have them delivered to you in the resealable merch by the pound bags too. Now mind you, they might be New York based, but their apparel is for everyone, whether you're from New York, Miami, Texas, Chicago. It's a grassroots movement. Get in tune. And they offer free shipping on all domestic orders of $75 or more. But if you enter the exclusive Infominds promo code, you'll get an additional 10% off at checkout. You already know I ordered my package. My package is on its way. So I'll be wearing and showcasing the Don't Hide the Plug apparel in my next live. Go out and support these brothers. Check out their website. I put the link in the description box. Don't hide the plug.
Prejudice. The 18th century conversation pieces, as they were called, frequently had black servants in attendance as symbols of wealth, but also as symbols of servitude.
Some black people could flourish in this gilded setting, but others ran away or were abandoned to join a growing underclass of sailors, entertainers, peddlers and thieves, now thronging England's cities.
Many were desperately poor. Many of them were beggars. You have rabbit sellers, you have market sellers, you have fairground performers, you have strolling actresses. They did whatever they could. They were highly visible in many areas of English life.
By the 1770s, there were up to 15,000 black people in England's cities. Among them was one runaway who was to strike the first blow in the battle for freedom. The abolition struggle began almost by accident, sparked by a runaway black servant, one of thousands living in fear of the slave owners. It would be decades before Britain's involvement with slave labour was completely suppressed. And in that time, the country would experience the emergence of racial attitudes which still pervade Britain today. Today, thousands of Britons are discovering their own part in the shameful history of Britain's slave trade. A history which is only now forcing its way back into our consciousness. 2 centuries before the Empire Windrush brought immigrants to post-war Britain, ships had already carried thousands of stowaways, sailors and servants across the Atlantic, all of them former slaves.
And I rang up my mother and said, Did you know that the Warners had slaves? And she said, Of course not, darling. Never, never. Of course they didn't have slaves. And it was completely naive of me to have imagined that a Caribbean family would not have been involved in that economy.
For over 300 years, the Warners played the part of a successful upper-crust English family. Their most famous son, Sir Pelham, captained and managed England's cricket team at the turn of the century. But he learnt his cricket back home, in the Caribbean. To most Britons today, the Caribbean islands are just a holiday paradise. But away from the sandy beaches, these islands hold the secrets of a forgotten history. Great houses stand empty, a mute testament to 400 years of British occupation.
Some of the worst aspects of slavery are that memories are broken, and chains of memory are broken. And one of the differences between coming from the sort of family I come from is that there's a record.
William Beckford inherited a fortune from his father's Jamaican plantations. He proceeded to spend it at an astonishing rate. He moved to Bath Spa, one of the planter's favourite towns. His fashionable Lansdowne Crescent home still stands. Robert Beckford is a young theologian from Birmingham. He is probably descended from Beckford plantation slaves, but he thinks that there's also a slave owner a white Beckford among his ancestors.
My interest in him is regarding my name. My name is Robert Beckford. William Beckford and his father, Alderman Beckford, to put it bluntly, owned my ancestors. There were slaves on their plantations in Jamaica. So my interest is in finding out the white side of my family, which is related to the Beckford family.
In Jamaica, the Kumina ritual is a remnant of the secret life of slaves, a reminder of the homes they'd left an ocean away. In the Caribbean, slaves now outnumbered whites 10-1, but white rule offered no room for rebellion.
There's a law which says that if a slave raises his hand to hit a white man, he can have his hand amputated. This was the sort of regulation that you actually had. These laws were now being passed directly by the Jamaican House of Assembly, which was dominated by planters, and generally approved in the House of Commons.
Many plantation owners were leaving the Caribbean, entrusting the management of their estates to overseers. These men were Creoles, white West Indians born in the islands.
Overseers were hard-driving people. They were often cruel to the slaves, although they weren't always. And they sometimes robbed their employers, and they really wanted to get production up and look good on the bottom line, and that they did. And it was done at the cost of the slaves that worked the plantation in many cases.
Chapter 1, West Indies. I was born in the island of Trinidad in the West Indies, where my father was at one time Attorney General. And my earliest recollections of cricket are of batting on a marble gallery to the bowling of a black boy who rejoiced in the name of Killibree. The glass windows of the bedrooms which ran along this gallery were often broken, and my father would say that I should come to a bad end. But perhaps he derived consolation from the bowler, who used to remark, "Beg pardon, sir, but I tell you, sir, Mr. Pelham, he make a fine bat, sir, when he grow big."
Marina Warner's grandfather is part of a history which stretches back more than 3 centuries, but which the family had chosen to neglect.
I had known my grandfather as a shrunken old man in South Kensington, and that this is where he started was a huge surprise.
The Pinney family had trepidation about selling most of their estates to Edward Huggins and his sons because they felt that he was a bit cruel, and they were really worried about what would happen to those estates that they had originally owned. He started as an overseer of a sugar estate when he was just 19 years old. He had no education except what he had here, because he was born in Nevis. He was the first generation here. I think basically in those days the fittest survives, and I think that Edward Huggins was really tough, and he didn't stand for any nonsense.
The slaves saw Huggins for what he was. They began to run away, first one by one, then in groups. Huggins had them caught and brought them back to the market square for a public flogging.
The first Negro received 365 lashes. Mr. Huggins gave another Negro man 115 lashes, and to a woman 110 lashes. The woman who received 291 lashes appeared young and was most cruelly flogged.
The flogging took so long that the drivers had to alternate laying the lashes on because it was too much for one man to do, in spite of the fact he was quite strong. 2 days later, the woman died of natural causes, according to the coroner, and the man was crippled for life and lived only a few years afterwards.
Even Huggins' fellow planters in the Nevis Assembly were appalled.
It is the opinion of this House that the conduct of Edward Huggins, Esquire, in inflicting punishment on several of his Negroes in the public marketplace of this town, was both cruel and illegal, and that particularly in 2 cases where 252 lashes and 291 lashes were given, he was guilty of an act of barbarity altogether unprecedented in this island.
From England, John Pinney, who had sold his slaves to Huggins, wrote in dismay at their disobedience.
I am truly sorry to hear that the Negroes have not behaved as they ought, and you wish. During my long residence in the island, no people could have behaved better in general than they did. We know the disposition of these people. They are apt to try the temper of a new master by not being as correct in their conduct as they ought at first.
But I have no doubt, with kindness and attention to their little wants, when they deserve it, you will find them a well-disposed set.
This is a history that takes some forgetting. It goes back to 1624, when Charles I gave Sir Thomas Warner this royal charter to colonize 4 Caribbean islands.
The said Thomas Warner hath lately discovered 4 several islands in main ocean, toward the continent of America. The one called the Isle of St. Christopher, another the Isle of Nevis, another Barbados, and another the Isle of Montserrat, which said island are possessed and inhabited by savages and heathen people,
and have caused divers of our subjects of this our realm to remove themselves to the said islands, with purpose to proceed in so hopeful a work. So that's the beginning of colonization of the Caribbean.
It may be that he didn't know what Huggins was like. This is possible. But I think it's unlikely. I think he probably did know. And I think he probably, for commercial reasons, sold these slaves to Huggins.
Huggins was tried in the island's courthouse by a jury of white plantation owners. He was acquitted.
He was hated by his slaves. They tried to poison him 9 times and didn't succeed, and he died falling out of his carriage when he was in his 70s. A lot of the white planters didn't care much for him either, but he was one of them, and they had to support him.
What the planters cared about was keeping slaves as their property, chattels.
If slaves were chattel, they could not be persons. They could not give evidence in court against whites. And this was to be a very important factor, because while the law did allow slave masters to be brought to court for various things, like abuse, since if honest slaves had witnessed the abuse, he would actually get away with the crime simply because slave evidence was not accepted.
The Warners are just one of many families who rose on the backs of slaves. At least a dozen still hold titles which were awarded or bought following their success in slavery. Baron Ashburton of the Barings banking dynasty inherited a slaving fortune, as did Viscount Cobham. Lord Liverpool is the descendant of slave owners, and the ancestors of Earl Harwood, the Queen's cousin, made the equivalent of £1 million from their slave holdings. Most slave-owning families have long since lost all record of that past. They have erased the history of Britain's slave descendants. Today, many of their descendants still live here. In the archives of Liverpool Library, one young man is seeking a link to his slave past. Lawrence Westgarth's family has lived in this city for at least 7 generations, but their story begins much earlier.
My ancestors were transported on ships as cargo, not as passengers, as literally as cargo, and to be bought and sold. It's something that I found hard to deal with. I personally don't feel it's worth getting angry about. I feel that people need to channel their energy into ways which are constructive. I see it as a quest.
Lawrence knows that his ancestor came here from the Caribbean over 150 years ago. His name was Robert Cox. This certificate shows his marriage in Liverpool in 1822. The records also say that he was a mariner, but beyond that, they are silent.
I couldn't tell you anything about Robert Cox. For me, he's just a name. He's a name on a birth certificate. He's a name on a marriage certificate. But in many ways, the connection of all my ancestors who I've traced is strongest with him, because I identify with him in a way which is in many ways signifies the same type of position I'm in. I feel in many ways that I'm searching, and I'm sure he felt the same, because him coming here and settling here was almost like was a journey. He was finding the place where he would feel at home, as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that he settled here tells me, well, you know, maybe the fact that he found a home here means that other people can find a home here.
To the slaves, the case sent a clear signal that the planters would never free them willingly. Their path to freedom would be marked by violent rebellion. In England, the absentee landlords were enjoying the fruits of their slaves' labor. They ignored warnings of revolt. Instead, the planters and traders built elegant new homes. England's streets were paved with West Indian gold.
They did show off. They drove the most ornate, gilded coaches. They had sort of, if you like, gold threads in their wigs. They behaved with a certain kind of arrogance because they had money. And so they became not only despised, but also feared. As one aristocrat put it, they drove up the price of venison, which of course is the noble meat reserved for the aristocracy. But now these people, these social upstarts, could buy venison. They drove up the prices of seats in Parliament because they were able to buy themselves into Parliament. So they were despised for buying themselves privilege.
The planters wanted to join high society. Instead, they were ridiculed. This tower was William Beckford's retreat and treasure house at the top of Lansdowne Hill.
There was this sumptuous drawing room, which it was called the Crimson Drawing Room, which was the room where Beckford did have